guest speaker for the African Heritage Parade Committee today. Thank you, Senator Rice.
Good morning. Good morning. Let me first of all get on to God, who is the head of my life, one who gets me up every day and gives me the strength to move up and down the state and throughout the country to do his work, which is the work of the people. Yes. Let me also acknowledge all the dignitaries and elected officials. Protocol has been set who are here today. A special shout out to my good friend, long-term friend, Governor Jim McGreevy. I want to thank Mayor Warren for the job she's been doing up here. I pay a lot of attention to Paterson for a lot of different reasons. I also want to acknowledge the president of this organization and the work that all of you are doing to deal with our heritage and to keep our history in perspective. And I also want to acknowledge, if he's still here, the election of the mayor-elect for your city, and I'm sure that he and I, directly and indirectly, will be having some conversation in the future, because anytime, any place I go, when I talk about the great city I live in, and been living in since 1955, the city of Newark, I talk about Paterson. And a special shout out God to one of my right-hand people in the New Jersey Legislative Block Caucus, which I chair, and that's a great elected official, Senator Ben Wimley, who chairs and co-chairs And so, I know that I was getting late because the problems that we always have in the black community is that we're always out of time. And then when we talk, no one wants to listen. And I think that is problematic to all of us, not just in the state of New Jersey and the black communities, but also throughout the country. It's time that we slow down and take all the time we need, particularly younger generation, to understand our history. We cannot talk about, the participation and the celebration of Black Heritage Day without understanding the history of black folk. It is the same thing. There's a day, but there's a month, but there's a history. And so if in fact we're going to talk about Black Heritage Day and black history, then we have to go back in time and understand, how we arrived to where we are today and how we got here and where are we now. I think that's very important. But in order to understand where we are now, it's important for us to understand our history of where we have come from. The pathways to where we are today basically began during the period of indentured servitude, a time where Europeans came to this country and started to stake their land. The problem was they needed someone back in the 1600s to work the land. And so they sent letters back to Europe and elsewhere and asked folk, would they be willing to come to America to work the land? Cheap labor, but work the land. And at that time, people responded, and there were contracts given for 7 to 10 years. And the commitment on the contracts were that if, in fact, you agreed to come, at the end of your contract, there would be some benefits. You would have some land and some other benefits. But during that movement in indentured servitude, the folk that came here were white folk and black folk and Asians. And they were not called slaves. They were called servants. But what happened was when those contracts started to expire and folk began to get their own land and get their benefits, there was no one left to work the land. And therefore, in 1619, that's when the first slave ship arrived in Virginia, because people wanted free labor. And the folk who looked like us, our ancestors, they were not called servants, they were called slaves, because there were no benefits offered. And as a result of that, our history began with strong black people. The heritage was about people who consistently try to run away. People who had fortitude, people who survived a lot of terrible kinds of things in their lives. People who were not even known as people, they were known as property, chattel. And so it's been a long history in this heritage that we are celebrating. But it's a very, very rich history. And so when we talk about that history, we have to talk about all those great people who did so much during slavery to get us into the era of the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, when we followed the pathway, in 1964, the landmark piece of legislation was enacted by Congress that was known as the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act was the act that outlawed this whole notion of folk being discriminated against because of sex and because of race and because of a national origin. But if you go back in time before then, in 1954, we had Brown versus Board of Education, because during the 1800s, there was a court decision known as Plessy v. Ferguson when we came out of slavery, and it was finally realized that we are people too. It said, that, okay, you can be people as black folk, but you're going to be separate but equal. And that's what brought us into the 60s. And that's what caused the 1954 Act, brought us into the 1964, the whole civil rights movement. And then we went into 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which Assemblyman Wimberly and I and others are still fighting today to bring about those kinds of rights that everybody should enjoy the Constitution, including, Governor, the people who are incarcerated. Amen. Voting rights has nothing to do with you committing crimes. And so we're trying to move legislation there too, because the whole notion is to make sure people of color don't vote. They constantly tell us that we're in jail 3 and 4 times more, and so it makes sense not to let us vote because of the way and how we vote. And then we came into the 1967 era, where we all remember, and those who are younger than us read about or heard about, hopefully, what was called the disturbance throughout the country. We refer to them as the 1967 riots. And then you had this whole notion when Lyndon B. Johnson was very much concerned about why all these cities were exploding. And what he did was he put together a commission known as the Kerner's Commission. And the Kerner Commission was supposed to go through all these cities and to find out why we were having riots. The assumption was that black folk were having riots because they were discriminating against white folk, and the KKKs had their issues against us. Contrary to the thought and the assumption, when the Kerner Commission came back to report to President Johnson, they said, Mr. President, you have a problem. And he said, what is the problem? He said, it's not caused because of the KKKs and the black folk and all these radical groups. The problem is like the French Revolution. We have stretched people so far that the rubber band is busting on the middle class. Poor people are getting poor and rich people are getting richer. There are no jobs, no housing, no health care, and no opportunities for black folk. That's what the problem is. And to fix the problem, it's going to cost a lot of money. But you need to bite the bullet. And as a result of that came the model city programs that were failures, but they were efforts that started to open the doors to where we are today. And so when I hear people here today talk about one Paterson, like we talk about one Newark, we better talk about ourselves first. Because everybody seems to be moving. Now, Assemblyman Wimberly would tell you, when I get on the floor of the Senate, I don't bite my tongue or with the media. I make it very clear when I start to talk about opportunities, I make it clear that I'm talking about black folks. Yes. And then I put with that, this going to hurt or help black folk, women, and other ethnic minorities. Because I found out as a black elected official and as a black person, coming from the civil rights movement, coming from the segregated South, I know when every time we said minorities and women, There's a little bit of progress, a very little bit of progress. But that little bit of progress goes to every other ethnic minority except for black folk. And so there's no shame in saying you're black. The Irish not ashamed of saying they're Irish. The Jews not ashamed to talk about the Holocaust. And we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about our history any place that we go. But talk about it with dignity and understanding the history and the heritage and the pathways that's got us here. So over the years, black people and women in particular have made substantial progress in our struggle and fight for justice and civil rights. But the struggle is not over. The rights and freedom fought for are being slowly taken away by both Democrat and Republican elected officials at all levels of government who are charged with the responsibility of making policies, laws that govern our lives. The election of President Donald Trump has many people in this country who are minorities, culturally disadvantaged whites, women, and immigrants very fearful of what tomorrow may bring in this country. The fear is compounded in New Jersey. In New Jersey, Assembly women, the political relationship divisiveness and the unjust treatment of women and minorities who are in leadership roles continue to be actively existing. The racist, discriminatory, and power-grabbing practices and policies depicted by political party leaders are of great concern to many taxpayers, voters, and residents in general. With the Donald Trump's victory for President of the United States, New Jersey middle-class workers, low-wage earners, poor people, and those who have nothing are now even more fearful of what 2018 will bring in New Jersey. And this fear, I can say it to you, is real. Make America Great Again is the buzzword for taking us back in time, taking us back pre-integration, taking us back to pre-marches, taking us back to the pre-demonstration, pre-sit-in, pre-the Freedom Riders, and pre-the court victories for civil rights and equal justice. That's what the buzzword is. Make America Great Again is the buzzword that motivates and brings together and brings to the forefront old and new leaders of the segregationists and the KKK groups of the past. Their values are being overtly articulated and acted out by both Democrats and Republican elected officials who share their values. Even in this state, it is clear to those of us, Doc, who lived during the era of segregation, 1953, during the era of segregation, it is clear to those of us who marched for equal rights and equal opportunities for all people. It is clear to those of us who are fighting for economic justice. It is clear to those of us who fought for civil rights. It is clear to those of us who fought for voting rights. It is clear to those of us who continue to fight for a free and quality education in public schools, Doc. It is clear to those of us who continue to fight to protect the rights of working people that our fears must become our motivation for action in 2018. I'm going to say it again. Our fears must become our motivation for action in 2018. If we are going to celebrate black heritage, we must be reminded that black struggle is not over. Black leaders must come together as did our leaders in the past to collaborate on policy issues and laws that impact our people and our communities. We must collectively work on strategies and logistics to determine the positive way our own destiny as a people. As black leaders and people of color, we must wake up, open our eyes, acknowledge and accept the reality that some New Jersey Democrats, like Republicans, have shown and continue to depict that they too have the Trump Make America Great Again mentality. And we know who they are, and they need to be called out. Some work hard to destroy public sector unions. Some try hard to intimidate and subordinate women and minority elected officials, leaders who are courageous enough to stand up and to speak out on behalf of taxpayers and voters because it's the right thing to do. Some use their elected positions and work hard to enrich their political friends at the expense of taxpayers. This compounded fear should be a wake-up call to New Jersey residents. It should make us all realize why we must pay attention to political issues and political relationships and why people should vote in every election. The fear of some persons in political leadership roles that the public continue to witness in their message and their actions should make it clear to minorities, women, elected officials, and particularly in working families, public sector workers, civil rights leaders, minority, women, small business, immigrants, and others living in New Jersey that we cannot afford to stand still. If we are to celebrate black heritage, it must be clear to people of color, in particular, that we cannot afford to be silent any longer. We cannot continue to live in fear of elected officials and political bosses who are bullies and vindictive in nature. We cannot afford to live in fear of elected officials who have their own personal agenda and who continue to play black elected officials and black leaders and black women against each other in order to accomplish their goal of enriching their lives and empowering themselves. These are the people who must be publicly called out. There should be no shame in calling names. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Silence, Dr. King said, can be golden, or it can be devastating, depending on the situation. When you stand silent about the things, Assemblyman Wembley, that matter and are important to life, then this is when your life began to end. In order for evil to thrive and flourish, all it takes is for good people to stand silent and not speak out. Many people knew what was going on during World War II, yet they stayed silent and did not speak out due to fear, but because they benefited from the events in some way. In 2018, my brothers and sisters, people's fears must become our motivation for action. Black people's fears must become our motivation to organize. Black people's fears must become our motivation to litigate. Black people's fears must become our fight to economic justice and a better quality of life for working families and for those who have the least. If we are to celebrate black heritage, we must always remember the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Nelson Mandela. Dr. King further stated, "When you see something is wrong, you have a duty as a human being to speak up. Standing against evil and being the voice of good is what makes your life meaningful and gives you a reason to keep going. When you stay silent, then you must answer to your conscience, and good people will be haunted by the fact that they did not speak up when it really mattered. Sometimes all it takes is a single voice to bring others to a cause, and your life will be enriched when you speak up for those who cannot, and when you speak against something that is not right." Nelson Mandela, who spent 25 years in prison for standing up and speaking out for the injustice against black people in Africa, stated, "Real leaders must be ready to sacrifice all for the freedom of their people." Sacrifice is being willing to give up something good for something better. Black elected officials, civil rights leaders, faith-based leaders, community organizations who are committed to valuing and educating and empowering leaders, promoting inclusion and respect for diversity, must not be silent when racism and discrimination is still the order of the day for some in this country and state. Black elected officials cannot afford to be silent heretofore as the elected leaders and collective voices of the black community. Black elected officials must work with the community to make certain that black lives do not end because of black silence. As black elected officials, we are fortunate. We are fortunate because we are blessed with the opportunity to do public servant work. We are the only people that make policy, the legislature, and laws that impact the lives of people in a positive and negative way. With this awesome leadership, responsibility comes good times and bad times, successes and failures, frustration and joy. As we celebrate black heritage, black elected officials cannot forget our history story of struggle. We cannot forget the lives that were sacrificed and the blood that was shed for us to have the opportunity to become elected officials, to become the policy makers and decision makers, the spoken voices and internal voices of black people in the legislature. This rich history mandates that we set aside our fears of the politics of the traditional political establishments and political bosses. The history dictates that black elected officials and black organizations set aside our political differences and find common grounds to work on policies and legislation that will enhance the quality of life for black people, other ethnic groups, women, working families, and others who are the struggling poor and culturally disadvantaged. The history dictates that black elected officials and civil rights leaders work with diverse organizations in collaborative effort to protect the civil rights and human rights progress made over the years. And in doing so, it will require educating the masses, organizing, mobilizing, litigating, and demonstrating when and where necessary. It is our collective responsibility in representing people of color to make certain that the voices of the black community and others are heard, and that our issues and concerns regarding economic justice, civil rights, economic opportunities are treated justly and fairly. In closing, I want to say this to you. I at least want to ask this question. To all of you who are assembled here today, we celebrate with parades and activities. But the question is, who will speak for the children? Who will speak for the elderly? Who will speak for the poor if we allow our lives to begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter? I want to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm sorry we had to rush through it, but I had a note that said please finish. Thank you very much for inviting me, and God bless you.